I think a lot of the issues do come from people not being heard. And if you do have better consultation, that's going to help. But it's not just the quantity of consultation, it's actually the quality of it and the methodology that you're using, right? And it's not just the fact that there's programs happening. Sure, it's great. You can run tens of thousands of programs, but if they don't have the right methodology or have the right accessibility, then they're not going to be used. If, for example, even in the city of Ride, if you look at our social plan, you'll see that mental health and social isolation are one of the biggest issues that young people are facing in the area. Something around, according to service providers, 70% of young people are facing. Despite that, our usage rates for mental health services are at about 7%. 7%, like that's it, of the entire capacity of the mental health service, only 7% of it is being used.
Wow. Why do you think this happens?
Well, we actually went out there and asked people, why don't you go to your mental health services? Why don't you see your school counselor? First answer we got, I don't trust the school counselor. They don't keep whatever I tell them a secret. They'll have to tell my parents, they'll have to tell the principal. True, correct. Sure. This happened to me. So, is it really a lack of services, or is it the policy and the structures of how we're implementing these services that are keeping people from using them as well?
Yeah, and the methodology also, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why I like to talk about methodologies, because, as you said, consultation can be very valuable in terms of, distributing, let's say, a survey or having a working group or a focus group. But sometimes I feel like if you can combine that with a process like we use in co-design or in asset-based community development, where people also get the space and time to connect and to have conversations, to use storytelling, as I mentioned before, and to form that social capital, you're actually having outcomes. People like to hear about outcomes from the actual process and methodology you use, because people feel more listened, heard, they feel more like the self-esteem improves, they feel connected to other people, maybe they make a friend, but also from the actual result, whatever the co-production will be, whatever will be co-designed at the end. And when it goes to mental health, I feel it's a totally different game. Now, I think you're getting into, interesting conversations here, Cosmin.
Yes. Well, I personally, the way that I see it, I think that community development, outreach services, mental health, if we want to take a more holistic approach at resolving all of this, I think all of it should be intertwined.
I agree. Actually, I don't know if you know, and people don't know probably, because in social media I talk about my social enterprise, Soul Gen and community development, but I'm a counselor, and I'm actually on the side of running my social enterprise. I do crisis counseling, like critical incident counseling. So I go to organizations, I go to detention centers, I go to different industries, and I hold like space for people one-on-one or group in times of crisis. So I see, in times of grief, in times of redundancy. And the reason I'm so passionate about community development is because I realize how important that is, I'll give you an example, a very quick example. I've been to a school in the South Coast, like where something happens with a teacher. I can't say the place, in terms of confidentiality. But I've seen the difference between a school in South Coast where the whole community mobilizes to help the actual teacher and the family, and you see everyone there caring and being there, being a small community, versus the impact of people, falling into cracks and breaking down and in a system where there is not enough humanity, in, let's say, in Sydney. So I've seen these examples, but I also know in terms of my own mental health and of the work that I do, how important it is like to come in a safe space and have an opportunity to share what you're going through. I think this is very powerful, and I don't know if this is happening enough. I was actually doing a survey through a Roselle Neighborhood Center project we're co-designing, an environmental cafe through a consultation and co-design, and young people talked about safe space repeatedly. They talked about safe space. And I also saw a post in LinkedIn about from Mayan. I know you're involved with Mayan. And part of the project, and you can talk a bit more about that, was also, I think I saw like radical care and safe space, wasn't it?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So talk to me a bit about that, about your journey. You talked about RIDE, the council, the gap that you saw, how you started Zoomers for Change, and I'm sure there is more story there. But I think also you're involved with Mayan, aren't you?
That's correct. Yeah, I'm a Mayan youth ambassador. There's many of us, and very proud to be part of such a great team. Really, I think if you are a young person and you are new to this country, you've moved to this country, Mayan is a great space to really just get in touch with your roots, and not in a sense of, well, your roots as, well, how do I put it, really? Mayan is just a great place to get back in touch with yourself, really, and explore who you are as an individual, and they allow you for you to do that. And I think that coming back to a safe space, I think that's what a safe space is really all about. Generally, I think sometimes people have this idea that a safe space can be based on censorship and can be based on limiting how we're allowed to explore our feelings. And actually, in a workshop that we were doing just this last weekend, we had one of these situations where a participant in the program was not, was wondering what's appropriate to share. Like, can I share my trauma with everyone, or is this a safe space? Do I have to rephrase my trauma? And that's actually it. I think in a safe space, that is ultimately determined by the participants. And the best thing that you can do as a facilitator, and really as anyone trying to build a safe space, is to open up people's capacity for hearing difficult conversations whilst still feeling safe. So it's actually, I would like to rephrase it and call it more of a brave space than a safe space.
I love that. Because I feel like sometimes we do take a safety position, but it comes from a place of fear, from a place of what if something goes wrong, and it doesn't give the dignity of risk to people.
It's just giving in. It's just giving in my opinion.
And it's about also denying yourself, and your trauma, because if they ask you to be involved sometimes, share your story in a conference, let's say, I'm just giving different examples, and talk about yourself, embrace your culture. If you are not allowed, if you don't have permission, invisibly or visibly to talk about some aspects, how can that be a transformational space? And I'm not saying everyone should start talking about everything and talking about their trauma anywhere. I'm not saying that. It does require, as you mentioned, good facilitation and particular skills to be able to hold space for those brave conversations to take place.
I also think it depends on the culture, because back in Romania, I mean,
let's talk about culture. I'm Greek, you're Romanian, so let's do it.
Yeah, like I don't know how it is in Greece, but in Romania, people love to complain, and they will talk about anything that happened to them, about their trauma, about their terrible childhood, about the fact that they don't have enough money to pay for rent, to anyone, and actually people are very open about how terrible life is for them. So that is actually a question. How does that change society? And is it actually okay to maybe be more open about talking about our trauma, and how, maybe is Australian society not open enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think, I've done some work in the mental health sector in the past. And for example, for the Greek community, even though Greeks, we also like to complain,
Yeah.
We are neighbors after all in Europe. We found though that Greek people are open to discuss mental health, because there is also stigma, in Greece, in the Greek culture many times, in terms of, talking about mental health, and, being open about talking about, if people are having issues or challenges. We found that theater is a very safe platform to do so. So when I was working in partners in recovery in the past, we used playback theater. We used different type of artistic interventions to get people to see something and remove the stigma and connect to that through someone else's story, and then talk about their own selves. So I feel like the thing of culture and what's culturally appropriate is very interesting, but also you're attaching into something that we also talk in the sector, which is about I mentioned about the top-down system before.
Yep.
But I also we have to acknowledge that we also operate in a very paternalistic, Eurocentric, white system in Australia many times, and this is something that we're also trying to hack, right? Where I see a lot of people saying the right things, but are we walking the talk? Are we really opening up to have those conversations about culture, about mental health, about what do you think?
That's actually a really good question. And yeah, it actually, if you want to really raise the bar on what walking the walk really means, I think a lot of us are going in with a model of what we think is right. Going in with, as you already said, solutions that we are coming up with outside of the community or situation that we're actually seeking to address. And we're trying to almost adopt a kind of blueprint approach to solving community issues, which by their very definition of community issues are each unique to their community, right? So that is actually a very good question, and is it one brought up? And I think, if I had to answer it and make a judgment call, I'd probably say, no, we're not really doing it in the best holistic way, or at least the sector as a whole is not,
Yes,
and
the majority of the sector, because there are examples, as you mentioned, of organizations and councils who are trying to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like your experience in Mayan. So I want to ask you about that, because I think we talk about theory. It's good to also ground it to examples, and from organizations and different experiences, especially for you as a young person. Yeah.
I just want to say, I think a big part of why that is part of the funding models. A lot of organizations wouldn't get their programs through unless they applied for a grant, and it's hard to apply for a grant and get it unless you know what your program's going to look like. But what if the first step of your program is actually to find out what your program looks like and do that in partnership with community? But then, of course, the problem is, how do you describe that on a grant application?
I think there are ways, Cosmin. I've been having this conversation with other people, even from different councils. There are ways to, there are methodologies, there are evidence on this type of approach that are more participatory, co-design with community. For example, the Harwood approach that involves community conversations, and we use that in different spaces. The question is, for me and for other colleagues of mine, we are talking a lot about mindset. Are people aware that we're operating in this top-down, quite as you said, interventional system, almost like a medical model that sees an issue and tries to solve it, cure it, and B, if we are aware, is there enough information and support out there for people to start developing this work without risking, everything, without risking funding? I'll give you an example. When I was invited as a consultant, to work with young people through the Roselle Neighborhood Center, the funding came from NDIS. So the organization was making more income from NDIS, and I'm honest with you, and the CEO is honest, from Roselle Neighborhood Center, and they got some of this income, a part of that, to fund genuine youth and community development. So what I'm saying, Cosmin, and maybe I'm wrong, feel free to disagree, is that when there is a way, when there is a will, sometimes there is a way. But is there a will? That's my question. And that's why I like to create and have those conversations like we're having today. Because for some people, they may have never experienced a conversation like this, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the best thing you can do is go out there and keep having conversations if you are in the space. And, for example, if you're in a similar spot to what Zoomers for Change is, If you're in an area without much infrastructure or real sector for community development and youth development specifically, the best thing you can do is probably getting, if it's youth, getting young people in a room, hearing, getting them to think aspirationally and actually empowering them to, take the first steps to building change, to build that will, really, because you raised a very good point. If there's a will, there's a way. So often there isn't a will. And, I think it is time for us to really get thinking about how we increase that will in the sector everywhere.
Yes. And I totally agree, and I, admire the work that you do with the Zoomers for Change. I want to go back to something you mentioned at the very beginning. Remember the question about what do you do to get people to listen?
Yep.
We say in ABCD, like one of the mentors, like Peter Kenyon. It's very, he's a community enthusiast, and he travels the world working with the asset-based community development. He said, let's not wait for the white cavalry to save us. And he said that because he wanted to make a point that sometimes, it's important to, and I believe that it's important to, to advocate, to change the system, to reform policies. I do agree with that. It's very important. That's how, business is conducted, community is conducted. But some other times I feel it's also important to be a bit of a change maker yourself, as you're doing with Zoomers for Change, and to go on a different journey and to create something new, and then to share that with others. So my ultimate answer is both. It's important to find ways to crack and hack the system and influence things. And I admire people who do that every day, They go to the parliament, they talk to their MPs, they go to these forums, they advocate. That's not easy. I wouldn't do that. I'm not doing that. But I also feel, a lot of innovation is needed in terms of youth-led and community-led programs, social enterprises, and find ways to empower ourselves and our communities and young people to lead the change they want in their communities. I know it's a process, but I feel maybe it's the way to go.
Absolutely. I think that, a big part of the issue of what we've always been talking about here is the very nature of that top-down approach being restricted from new people coming into the sector and changing how, you do things. And really, I think the only way that you can come in and actually change things and create something new and build something for your community when the top isn't up for it is exactly as you said, to go and do it on your own, see if you can do it as a grassroots initiative. And actually, if you do achieve that, perhaps you might not get as much funding, perhaps you might not get as much industry recognition or anything like that. But the truth is, I think you would have done far more work and far more impact, even if less people showed up, because you are just limitless in your methodology. You can really advocate for your participants to do and achieve anything. And at the end of the day, you're building a community, which is the goal.
Amazing. And I think at the end of it, also like super confident and having a good night's sleep, right? By living with your values as you are doing, isn't it?
Well, whoever can have a good night's sleep during lockdown. Yes.
Yes. When it's not the lockdown. But I'm saying that, Cosmin, because even talking to you, I'm really admiring how confident you are and how wise. And I'm sure that it's because you have also had the courage or lack or opportunity, to take a risk and, do something about the issue you saw and start something new, right? Start your own innovation and be a change maker. And I feel the amount of confidence you win and satisfaction is big, isn't it? Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it. And I'm not saying that's not also a challenge. I'm not, I'm acknowledging also that it's not an easy path, right?
Well, it's very
but
difficult.
it's a rewarding one. Yeah.